I guess we'll get started. So last week we finished off. We were going to try to do edit, update, and destroy last week. We didn't quite get there. We got to the point where we had our form. What else did we do? Oh, we basically added our authentication helpers and our administration checks and our authenticated check, right? So we went through our application and added all those pieces in place. Basically just to make sure that our application was working, and that way we could restrict what people could view based on their role, and also restrict what they could view based on the fact that they were authenticated or not. So, just because everybody's kind of just coming in now. The rest of you that have your laptop set, if you want to open up WAMP. WAMP. And once you got the little green icon, go ahead to our browser. And we'll go to localhost /comp1006. And we'll open up our lesson 4 file. We are actually going to download lesson 5 this week, and we're going to work with lesson 5 this week. You know what? Why don't we do that first? That makes more sense. I'll wait for everybody to get up and running, though, before we do that, just because everybody just came in. It's not going to affect anything with us having WAMP open anyways. All right, once you have your laptops up and running, go to Blackboard. Not Blackboard? That was, no, due to snow squalls. That was yesterday. That was because the weather was not being friendly yesterday. I canceled class yesterday because of the weather. Yeah. I just record it and post it to YouTube and when that happens, so it's not really a big deal. I don't think you guys have had a canceled class yet, have you? One? Just one? All right, go to weekly learning. And we finally have a lesson 5 lesson. Go to lesson 5. Yeah, we've advanced. We've moved on. You like living in lesson 4? Not only do we have a lesson 5, we also have a new quiz, which is good. So another markable. I haven't put a due date on it, so just do it when you want to. You have 3 attempts at it, so make sure you study up. The top link is a lesson 5 lesson plan, so that's just a link to our regular lesson plans, but this will be edit, destroy, and update. If you go there, you will see the beginnings of lesson 6 there as well. Lesson 5 starter files is what we want, so just click on lesson 5 starter files to pull the files down. And those will download to your machine. Take a total of not even 10 seconds to come down because it's surprisingly not that much, not that big of a file. Once you have the starter files, go to your downloads directory where they likely exist. You'll see a lesson 5 zip file in there. The only real change I've made to our application to this point is I kind of cleaned up the way we're doing our connect. So I turned it into a connect function. So anybody who downloads this will have the connect function. You don't have to download this starter file. You're not required to. If you want to continue on from where you left off last week, you're totally welcome to do that. However, if you feel like there's just too many things wrong, it's probably a good idea to start at this file. It will definitely fix anything that you've had issues with. If yours work perfectly, just leave it. Yeah. No. Our application has advanced to a lesson 5. Yeah. You may be using lesson 4 code though, but that's totally rename the directory, dude. You're like, I'll add 10 in there and then it'll be lesson 10. Yeah. What's that? It's literally just the connect function I made a function instead of being an iffy just because it was confusing a few people. So yeah. All right, so lesson 5, I'm going to extract it. So you can click extract all, or you can just double click it. Actually, sorry, don't double click it because it doesn't extract. Right click and extract all. And I'm just going to let it extract to its default directory here. Why are there so many people here? This is so strange. Do you guys think it's a test or something today? No? Did I think this? It's like that. Not a turn, like a midterm. It's not a fine. Worth 1% for fuck's sake. All right. So unfortunately, when I compress these things, it tends to compress them within another file. So you wind up with like lesson 5 within lesson 5, which is kind of annoying, but that's what it does. We want this inside lesson 5, not the one at the root of our downloads, but the next one in. Okay? Because if you click on it, you'll see all the files in there. So you want this one. So I'm going to copy it. So you can right click and copy. And then once you've copied it, you can go over to your little WAMP. Click on the www directory, which will open up. Go to comp1006. And then paste. And lesson 5 will paste in here. So now it will be accessible to us within our application. So I'm going to right click on this, rename it to lesson 5 Wednesday. You guys can just keep yours as lesson 5. The next thing I want to do is open up lesson 5 in my IDE. So I'm going to click on my IDE. I'm going to make sure I have my file folder open here as well. And I'm going to drag this into my IDE and drop it. So that will open it up in the background. Or it should have, but it didn't. I think it's because I have release notes open there. Let me try that again. Whoop, not that directory. There we go. And now I have lesson 5 open, and I'm ready to write code. So I'm just going to jump over to the browser and show you what we've actually completed at this point. I'm going to go to localhost comp1006, and I'm going to click on lesson 5. And it's going to look exactly the same as lesson 4 does, right? Because it's where we finished off. So if you had a working app, there's not really any new features. I didn't add anything. It's just basically what we finished with. I only made one small change with the connect script. So you should have 3 links, your My House, About Me, and Contact Me, right? And at some point, I thought we'd fill these out, but I feel like it's just not necessary. We have register, which works. We can actually register a user. A default user will always be registered with what role? Does anybody remember? No. What's that? Yeah, just the general role, right? Yeah. I mean, if you want to make every single person an administrator, you can, but then at some point you're going to need a role above them, right? It's just going to become an issue. Yeah, it's a free-for-all. Let's see how much destruction people can do. So yeah, we have our register form, and when we were finished by the end of last weekend, the week before, we had the ability to log in. So now we can actually log into our application and use our application as an administrator if we log in with the administrative role, or we can log in as a general user and control it that way. The only difference currently really between a general user and an administrator user is user management. A Administrative user can actually create new users while logged in. They can see all existing users in the database, and they can view an individual user's profile. We're going to continue this same idea as we go along and develop. When we create, edit, and destroy, an administrator will be able to edit another user besides themselves. And if they want to delete somebody, they can go ahead and delete somebody as well. The only limitation there is the administrator cannot delete themselves. That's the only limitation they'll have. However, we will allow a general user to be able to destroy themselves. It's totally fine. All right, we'll be GDPR friendly, which is that whole idea that you are allowed to remove your data from an application. All right, let's, why not? Let's just get started. So right now we don't actually have the edit page in place. We have our 5 files. Yeah, 5 files. We have index, new, show, and create. New and create kind of work together, right? And that form.php obviously works with new. That form.php is also going to work with edit. So we're not going to have to write up a whole brand new form. We can actually just include the form directly into the edit page. In fact, most of the content of new is going to move over to edit anyways. So instead of actually going through and writing all of edit, what we'll do is just copy and paste new and rename it to edit. So to do that, if you click on new to highlight it, it's going to pop up here. Oh, it looks like my styling reset. I've lost my synthwave. So I'm clicking on new. I'm going to right click and choose to copy it, not copy paste, just copy. And then I'm going to right click on users and tell it to paste, and it will create a new file called newcopy.php containing the same content as the new.php. Want me to go through that again? All right. So I'm going to right click on new, and I'm going to choose copy, or I'm going to hit Control-C. Totally your choice. Once I've done that, I'm going to right click on users, and I'm going to choose to paste, and it will create a new file in there with the word copy in it. And then I'm just going to rename it by right clicking on it and choosing to rename. And we're just going to call it edit.php. The only reason we're doing this is because new and edit are almost identical with only a few, very few minor changes. Well, I wouldn't say they're entirely minor. One of them is pretty epic. We have to actually go get the existing user and populate the form, pre-populate the form with their information. So that way when you edit the user, you know what values were there before. So we do have that step to do. But other than that, most of it will be exactly the same. This whole idea down here with the layout, the included form.php, the footer, all that stuff is the same. We're not really going to touch any of this stuff at all, actually. Everything we're going to do is above that fold line. We're going to be up in here. All right. I'm going to grab a chair because my legs are hurting. There. All right. Give me 2 seconds here just to re-enable my synthwave, just because it looks much prettier when it's re-enabled. There we go. Got all my glows back. I'm happy. I don't require much. All right, and I'll zoom in a bit because this is zoomed out pretty far. It's going to make it difficult to see. There we go. So we're zoomed in. So the file we have open currently is edit.php, which is a duplicate of new.php. Okay, so our first step in order to work with edit is to actually get the user. If we look at the current way the form is, this isn't going to work this way because we wouldn't know what to change for the user if we decided to modify the user, right? For example, if you were to modify yourself, I don't know that my name, well, I know my name is Sean, but if I'm an administrator, I don't necessarily know that that user that I'm editing's name is Sean. And the one thing about editing, the way this works in almost every single application, is if you, what they do is they repopulate the form with the details, and when the details get submitted to the update page takes those details and immediately, it's called nuking and paving. It basically overwrites the entire record with whatever details it got back. So it's kind of cheeky, but what we usually do is we pre-populate these values in place, right? And then when they go to change the value, they can just change, you know, this to say my name changed to Brad. They can change the name to Brad, but then McKinnon will still be written properly to the database, and so will Sean.McKinnon@georgiancollege.ca. It's not smart in the back end, and it actually is really inefficient for you to check each value and see if they are the same and then just ignore them. It's much easier to nuke and pave, which is just literally say, I don't care what's in there. Whatever data I have, I'm going to overwrite that data with it. That is much simpler, okay? We get into a bit of a trick with passwords, though. We could go through the whole 9 yards and like try to install and like create a password reset, but that would require us to be able to send emails and all this other stuff in order to go through that process, and I feel like it's a little too advanced. So instead, what we're going to do is, if there's no password inside this field, we won't reset the password. If there is a password inside there, we'll check to see if password and password confirmation match. If they do, then we'll overwrite the password inside the database with the new password hashed. Kind of simple logic, but it will work for what we're doing. All right. So what we want to do is we want to create the edit page so that this doesn't look like a blank form, but instead it's populated with the user's data. So the cool thing is we've already done some of these patterns at this point. Think about when we have a profile, right? So if I log in as Sean, and if you want to log into yours, go ahead. Just make sure you're an administrator, okay? Make sure you're the administrative role. If I log in as Sean, and I'm going to create, what the heck was I going to do now? I forget what the heck I was talking about even. Crap. Where was I? Oh, right, the user. If I log in as Sean, if I go look at a profile, like my profile, for example, we use this ID to actually pull back our user. We're actually using that parameter to grab the user. That logic that we've learned to code inside of show.php, we need to actually port that same kind of logic over to edit. So when the user wants to edit, we'll go to edit.php. We'll provide this ID equals, and whatever ID it is that we're of the user that we want to edit will then get passed to that script. We'll reach into the database just like we did with show, grab that user back, and then use those details to populate our form. It's pretty simple, actually. So a lot of these things, a lot of these patterns that we've already learned how to do are going to start showing up more and more as we build out more. Next week, when we start working with parent and child relationships, all the patterns we've done, you're going to see all over again, because we're going to need to actually use those same patterns to go and grab our parent and our child resources. So it's just a repeat, wash and repeat over and over again. All right, so I have edit.php. I've inserted this ID equals 20. But right now, I have no data. And the reason I have no data is because the form currently, well, not our form, but our edit page is still based on new, and new doesn't go grab an existing user. So let's go ahead and make that change. So our step one is we're going to modify it so that we can grab an existing user from the database. So we'll create a brand new, fresh little PHP block. And we'll write get existing user using get param. So first, obviously, we'll need our SQL. So we'll write our SQL statement. And it's the same SQL statement you generally use to grab any existing resource based on a condition. So it's select star from users, which is the table that we're working with, where ID is going to be equal to a bound parameter. So just a simple SQL statement. Now we're ready to actually prepare our statement and store it in a variable. So we're going to access our connection, prepare $SQL. Now, obviously, before we use this con, we're going to need our connection. So we need to bring in our connection, include our connection, and we'll just include it once. So, root dot includes underscore connect dot php. And to create the connection variable, it depends on how you created your connection script. If you used an IFI, you don't need to do anything right now. You're fine. You can just continue on. If you downloaded my code from this week, or you're using just the regular function, you'll have to do $con equals connect, like so. And then that will create your connection variable. So if you're using my code, lesson 5 that you pulled from Blackboard today, that's the way you'll do it. If you're using your code from last week, you'll need to go look at your connect function and see if you were using an IFI or just a regular connect function. If you don't know what an IFI is, it's likely you're just using the regular connect function. All right, so our next step is to bind the parameter. So we have this parameter that we said is going to exist. Now we need to bind the value to it. So we access the STMT, right, the statement. We call bind param on it. We first tell it what we're binding to, what placeholder we're binding to. We provide the value that we want to bind. So we'll just get the ID from the address bar by pulling that query parameter. And we tell it what we want it to be casted to. So we'll cast it to a param integer. After that, we'll go ahead and execute it. And once we execute, what execute will actually do is it will return back whatever the return result is and store it inside statement. And then we can use commands to grab that data from it. We can use fetch to grab a singular row. We can use fetch all to grab all of the resources that we return. We can use count to grab the count of the number of records back. There's quite a few functions that we have the ability to work with. Next week, when we actually build the parent-child resource, we're also going to do some pagination, and we'll get to see some of these other functions we haven't seen yet. All right, so this is going to require a little bit of an explanation. When we built our create script, just leave your cursor floating there. When we built our create script, we made it that if the user didn't fill out all of the details of the form, so here I've typed in ASDF, ASDF, and ASDF at asdf.com, right? So I have those details inside my form, but I haven't put a password in, which means this form will not validate, right? It'll return back and tell me there's an error. But it doesn't just turn back and tell me there's an error. It repopulates the form with our details in place, right? And I know it's been a little while. You might forget how that's actually happening. Basically, what we do is this data goes back inside our post object, right? If we hit an error in our code, we take that post object and we assign it to a variable called session form data. And then we read session form data, and if it has any data in it, we repopulate the form with that data. So that's how this one works. Incidentally, we're also following a naming convention that will allow us to hack into this, take the user we just retrieved, and do the same process with that user by simply pushing it into the session form data variable. So we'll do the step first, and then I'll show you a little infographic I created that basically explains how that works. It makes sense once you see it. So first, let's do this part. So we're going to create the session variable form data. And what we'll do is, just because we want to make sure, or actually we don't need to do that. Yeah, we'll do this simply for now. So we'll take the statement, we'll do a fetch, and that will return back our user row record and store it right into the session form data for us. All right. So if we jump back to our page, to our browser here, click on your profile page, then change the word show inside your URL to the word edit and hit enter. And you should see now that your form is populated with the information from your user. So I'll walk you through that one more time. Click on my profile, change the word show that's in the URL to the word edit, and hit enter. We'll create a link later. It's not a big deal. So some of you have understood the idea that our form naming and our database naming are separated. Might be a bit confused on how this is actually working. So we're going to go through quickly and explain how this works. So if you go to the weekly lessons and you click on the lesson 5 lesson plan, I'll zoom in a little bit and scroll way down. We did all this authentication stuff last week. We're coming down to here where it says get the user, and the code we just wrote is basically this block in a nutshell. This talks a little bit about our form data and how it works. But here's our block. So how we use user to make form values. So one part when you're building an application, and you might have already taken this in some of your earlier programming classes, is coming up with coding conventions, right? So coding conventions are just as important as learning code itself. It's also just as important as learning programming patterns, right? So programming patterns, coding conventions, and the code is how you become a decent programmer. What coding conventions are is it's like a set of rules. It's a set of rules that you follow as an application developer. So for example, when you're naming variables, this is a big one, right? When you're naming variables, you might start out with naming your variables $_ and whatever the variable name is. And then later on, you might be like, well, you know what? I don't really like that format anymore. So you might start out by doing this kind of thing. And then later on, you might say, you know what? I'd rather butt it up against. Or you might say, oh, you know what? I really like that new coding style where they're just using capital letters like that. Or you might decide to do something crazy like or camel case type stuff. But the thing is all 5 of these are completely different, right? To a computer, none of these mean the same thing, because each of these characters, though they contain all the same letters, means something completely different to a computer. That's fine, though. As long as you maintain the variable throughout your code, there's no issue. So if you decide to do this in one file and do this in another file, that's completely valid code. What it isn't, though, is valid coding convention, because what you're doing is you're breaking your own convention. So if you define the convention of how you're going to name variables in this format, and then halfway through your application, you start doing this format, you're rendering your code unreadable. It makes it more difficult for a new user or a new developer coming into your code base to understand what you're actually writing, right? So when we name variables, it's usually a good idea to take a look at how other people are coding that code. So for example, in Java, do you guys use camel case mostly when you name variables in Java? Okay. In PHP, you've noticed I use underscores. That's the common convention in PHP, is with underscores. All variables contain underscores. In Ruby, same thing. All variables contain underscores. In JavaScript, it's camel case again. So when you guys start taking JavaScript, it'll seem more familiar because the coding conventions are very similar to each other. Coding conventions isn't just in how a variable might look. It's also in the way you write a variable based on the data it's holding, okay? So for example, one of the conventions I taught you guys last week or the week before is if my function, for example, is going to return a Boolean, I always prepend it with the word is, and then whatever the symbol name would be. A developer that encounters this is going to know that this is always going to return a Boolean of some sort, right? This is a convention, though. This is not PHP's programming language. PHP doesn't give a shit if you start your symbol names with is underscore. It means nothing to it. But what it does mean to another developer coming in is, hey, this guy uses is underscore, and every time he does this, it returns a Boolean. They know when they encounter this structure that they're going to get a Boolean every time. Again, just coding convention. It's teaching somebody how to code things. So another thing about naming as well, say the value that our variable has is an array that contains multiple values in it, right? So say I have an array that contains every user in my database. Makes sense that because it's an array and it contains all of my users, to apply an S to the end of it, because this describes its data. I have multiple users, therefore I use plural to describe what's inside that source. If I pull back one record, right, so just one user, then obviously I use a singular form because I only have one record. That, again, helps any other developers or even myself 6 months from now to understand what is getting inserted into this value, right? I know it's multiple records. That tells me that it's multiple records. Not only does it tell me it's multiple records, but I can assume anywhere I see that it's likely an array full of records, just because it ends in a plural, right? So I get a lot of information just by those names. The last naming convention step is ensuring that your database column names are reflected when you're building your forms, right? So what I have seen and I've actually seen teachers here at the college do this too, and it's definitely bad practice. So there's two things about databases actually that kind of piss me off. One is a database is a representation of multiple resources, right? So when you're building a database table, it's not going to just have one row in it. It's going to have hundreds of rows or thousands or millions. Like our database at GShift for our keyword search engine collection, I just looked at it today. It's 12.5 billion rows, which is a lot of records. It's actually documents because it's Mongo, but you get the idea. So when you're naming a table, just like you name an array, right? If it contains multiple of a value, then you need to name it in plural. The same thing goes with your database tables. So if you have a database, like our database is called comp 1006, right? And we have one table in there that contains multiple users, so we named it users, because it makes sense. Those two things coincide with each other, so it makes perfect sense. However, I've had teachers in the past, and I've seen it in students' code, where they just call it user. Or even worse, this one annoys me more than anything. They'll call it comp 1006 underscore user. And the reason why that annoys me is I already fucking know it's comp 1006. I called the damn database comp 1006. I don't need to know that the table is also comp 1006. I already know that information, so it doesn't make any sense to me. And second of all, I don't have just one damn user in my database. I have multiple users, so I'm going to call it users. By the way, this is not stuff that I just picked up when I started PHP and going, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. I learned this when I started using model view controller systems because they force you to do this type of stuff. And that's when I picked it up and said, yeah, that makes perfect sense. The next thing, when I'm naming my fields, I name them descriptively. This is a very common one for user tables. F name, L name. The heck is F name, L name? Yes, we can generally ascertain that it's likely first name, last name, right? But it's not descriptive, right? I'm an English-speaking Canadian person. I can generalize that likely means first name. But if I'm not an English-speaking Canadian person and I come from another place and I'm working with somebody else's data, that can mean something entirely different. That doesn't necessarily have the same context. So I can help somebody else, especially when we work in this era where we have so many remote workers from other areas of the world. I can help them out by simply titling that first name and last name, because it's descriptive. It tells you exactly what's in the field, and you can Google Translate that if you need to. It's not a big deal. You can figure out what those columns mean. Makes things easier on people. The other thing, when you're naming your database table names, you should consider the programming convention that you're using. These should follow the same convention that you name your variables with, right? So you'll notice anytime we pull a user, we call it $user and $users. We haven't assigned a value off to first name or email yet, but if we did, the variable I would create would look like that. It would look exactly like the column name in my database, and that would be on purpose, right? I maintain the same naming convention style as the programming language in my database column names. And the same goes, in a new color of chalk. The same goes if I decide to name a field name in my form. So when we look at forms, right, each of these fields has a name. That's how we're able to find it when we send it off to the next script, right? That name is what we use. So when I name these fields, I name them the exact same way the columns are named in the database. And I do that on purpose, right? So the name for first name in that scenario would be name. Right? It's exactly the same format. I don't deviate away from the naming convention. I maintain that convention everywhere. And what it does is it makes my life a lot easier, because when we submit this form, PHP is going to take all of these fields. It's going to create that wonderful $_post object for us. It creates it automatically, right? It sends that post object to the update.php page or edit or create.php page, whichever place we're sending it to. If I want to access this field, I have to access it by the name I gave it when I created the form. So when you look at the code for a form, we have this name attribute, right? That name attribute is what PHP is using to create the field name inside the associative array $_post. That's how it does it. It takes that as the key, and then it takes your value as the value that it assigns to that key. Makes sense, right? So when I go to take this whole form and I send it off to the back end and I have an error, it's in that nice little format. All of the keys inside the post body are the same keys as this thing, as the form. If I hit an error, I literally send that post right back to the form. We do a little bit of extra stuff, and then we can spit out each of the values. Let's see if you're following me here. My form field names are the same names as my column names in my database. When I fetch a record from my database, the structure I get back is almost identical to the structure that I get from a post. They look the same. So I created a nice little graphic to show that. This is the structure I get back from the database. When I do a fetch, I get back this array. So it's called an associative array. So instead of indices, 0 through to whatever number, I get keys, ID, first name, last name, email, password, avatar, role, created at, and updated at. That comes back from the database, okay? That structure looks identical to the post structure. ID, first name, last name, email. By making those two structures identical to each other, all we have to do is, if we want to repopulate that form, we're going to kind of piggyback on the fact that when error handling happens, it populates the form for us again. We're going to piggyback on that functionality by just giving it the user that we just fetched, which means now all those user details are going to wind up getting inserted into the form, because that's the natural functionality of the form right now. How much does that make sense? It's a little convoluted. I've given tons of graphics that should hopefully explain it in nice detail, take it slow. But once you understand, it makes sense. And it makes sense from a programming perspective on why we would do that, right? Makes our lives so much easier. Because all I need to do, to put it quite bluntly, to fuck up this whole arrangement, is change the names in these columns. If I had F name, L name in these columns, I can't do that wonderful magic that I want to do, because I can't rely that the user object that I get back will look anything like the post value object that I get, right? Those two things will no longer match. Now I need to create more logic to deal with it. It's much more of a headache. But by maintaining my naming convention, I can make my life a lot easier. Cool? Any questions about any of that? No? Awesome. Does it make a little more sense to why we can see the data in this form? Yeah? All right. Cool. So right now, edit, we have our user. That's what's coming back in this block. We're just assigning it to session form data. We pick up session form data in our header file, our header.php, right here. We check to see if session form data exists. We assign it off to this form data variable, and then we clear it. So that data will only live for that one life cycle. However, for us in the edit form, it'll live continuously because every time we refresh our page, we fetch the user again anyways, so it's a moot point, right? Once we have that form data, so it's all assigned off, we pass it to header. The next page to load up will be our actual form itself. The form is going to check for form data. If there isn't, it will just sign off a null object. And then we do this. Form data, first name, or null. So if there's a first name, it'll populate it. If there's a last name, it will populate it. And if there's an email address, it will populate it. We don't pre-populate passwords. Out of curiosity, do you know why? Do you know why we wouldn't populate their current password? Actually, the best question is, can we? We can populate their current password in the way they typed it. Exactly how they typed it in, can we repopulate it that way? How many of you say yes, you can type in their raw password back into the database? How many of you say no? Okay, cool. Why can't we? Exactly. We're hashing it. Because we're hashing it, hashing is a one-directional, it's unidirectional hashing, which means we can't decrypt it back to raw text. Now, that doesn't mean that people don't do stuff like that, because they do. Facebook just recently got caught doing that. So what Facebook is doing, when you type in your password, not sure if you knew this, you can actually type it in slightly wrong. And what Facebook will do is take that raw text password you just type in, run it through about 200 different combination algorithms, and as long as you're close enough, we'll log you in. That's a new thing. I think that's a security breach. I see that as being a problem. We never, ever store raw passwords. We handle raw text passwords for as short time as possible and get them to a hash, because we don't want to be ever accused of taking people's passwords. We don't want to deal with their passwords, and we definitely don't store them. Never store them raw. Always hash them, because when you hash them, it's only one directional encryption, which means once it's encrypted, that's it. There's no way to get it back to the raw password, which means you're protected because you're not storing a raw password in your database. So no, the answer is we can't populate it. We could populate the hash, but it would have no meaning to the user. They would just see 65 or 128 characters of garbage. So it wouldn't make any sense to them. So we leave it blank. If the user wants to change their password, all they need to do is fill out these fields. As soon as those fields are filled out, we'll detect that in our update script and we'll modify and change the password for them, which I think is probably a fair way to deal with it. We have one other issue. I'm going to right click on this field and choose inspect, and I'll show you our issue. So this is the structure that gets generated by the PHP compiler. You can do this on any web page. You can go and inspect the web page. Did you guys learn inspect inside your HTML class? Okay, good. So if we look at the form, our form action points to Comp 1006, Lesson 5 Wednesday, users create. It's pointing to the wrong place, right? We need the action to point to update, not create. So if we go look at our code, so here we are on the form, we can see the reason why is because we have it hard-coded in the file that it's pointed to. So this is a bit tricky. Because we're including the form in another file, we need the file that wraps it to essentially tell it where it should go, right? So what we'll do in our edit.php file, right here we have title inactive. we're going to create a new variable called action. And action is going to point to base path dot slash users slash update dot php, and we'll save that. Don't worry, we'll take a break in probably about 5 minutes. So we're not going to create an action variable in create.php, and we're going to do that intentionally. We can actually use this variable to also tell basically what page we're on. So if we're in create, this variable won't exist. If we're in edit, this variable will exist. Obviously, the form doesn't know any information more than what we tell it. So if we jump back to the form.php, is anybody still typing that out just before I switch? Okay. We're typing out this line here. All right, so once you have action base path, are you good? All right, once you have that, jump over to your form.php. And right up here where there's form data, we'll actually enter that to the next line because we're going to take advantage of this spot. Make sure you end that line in a semicolon. Whoops. Sorry. I get using my Mac for a little while, and then I forget all the Windows commands again, and yeah, just jumping back and forth. All right, so in here, we're going to basically say $action is equal to action. Sorry, that's wrong. Underscore action, my apologies, is equal to $underscore action, or base path dot slash users slash create dot php. So basically what we're saying is that the action will be either equal to an action if it is defined, or action will by default always be equal to create.php. So if that action variable doesn't exist, which it doesn't in new.php, then we'll default to create.php. If it does exist, then we'll use whatever action is defined. And then just a little further down, right here where we have the action defined, we'll take it out and we'll replace it with $underscore action, like so. So you're writing this, and you're writing this. Those two lines. Don't forget to save. All right. So now this will point to update.php, but we obviously don't have an update.php page. So open up your sidebar, and under users, right-click on the word users and add a new file, and you're going to call it update.php. For now, just before our break, we're going to add one line to here, var dump $underscore post, and that's it. So that will spit out our post form and allow us to basically test our page to make sure our page is working. All right, once you've done that, go ahead and fill out your edit form and hit submit. All right, so you'll fill out your edit form. So I'm going to call this person Fred, and I'm going to hit submit. And it's saying this user already exists because I forgot to refresh. Need to refresh. Change this to edit. ID equals 20. Did I not type edit right? I typed edit wrong. There we go. And I'll call this person Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch. There we go. And I'll hit submit. And once you hit submit, you should see the array in the post. So I think that's a good place to take a break for a minute. If you have any issues, feel free to meet me at this table. I will help you with whatever errors you have. Otherwise, we'll meet back here at 8:15. Okay, so now everybody should have this basically dumped out to their page with the stuff they put in there. So at least we know that our action is working. We're getting data where we're expecting data to be. So our next step is to actually do the same thing we did in Create, which is validate, sanitize, and normalize that data to make sure that it's, you know, nice and pure before we put it into the database itself, right? So that's our next step. That's going to be our update action. So the cool thing about update that you're going to notice right off the bat is it kind of incorporates things that we learned in show.php with retrieving the user, and some steps that we were in create.php with actually validating, sanitizing, normalizing, error handling, all that type of stuff. We're going to see that all over again, right? So step one of our actual create or our update script. So we can gonna get rid of this. You can comment it out if you want to. I'm just gonna eliminate it altogether because we don't need it. So step one is always to include our config file. Our config file is going to basically follow us around everywhere we go because it's the most important thing we need. It contains all of our base configuration stuff, plus the connections to all of our helper files. So it's super important that we always have our config file with us. Because all of our error handling and our successes are all going to be controlled through the session, and if we need to take the form data and send it back, that will also be done through the session. We need to make sure we have the session with us, right? So let's make sure it's started. So we'll do a check if session status equals PHP session none, right? So if we have no session, it's not currently active, then session start. I'm going to collapse my side browser here because it's in the way. And I'll write a comment above that. Start session for form data, error handling, and success handling. Let's create a container to hold our errors. Error container. We'll just create a variable called errors. And let's see how well you guys are paying attention earlier. It's called errors. What data type do you think it's going to be? An array? Yep, it'll be an array. It makes sense, right? Because it's in plural, it makes perfect sense. So we're going to verify that our required fields aren't empty. And our required fields have changed a little bit than when we had our create page, because our create page, every field was required, right? So our first name, last name, email, password, and password confirmation were all required fields. And if any of them were empty, we would kick back to the user and say, hey, dummy, fill out these fields. This time, it's a little different. We only really care about the first name, last name, and email containing a value. And the reason is because if there is no value in the password, we are not going to change it, right? If the password is empty, we will leave it alone. If the password is modified, if they've added some sort of value to the password, then we'll have to make sure we go ahead and change it, okay? So this time we're only checking the 3 fields. So we'll create a variable because we won't be able to just iterate through post. We'll create an array here of all the required fields. So first name, last name, and email. Whoops, needs to be quoted. So those field names are obviously the field names that are in our form. They will also be the keys that come back from the post super global because all those things connect. Next, we'll iterate over that array. So for each required as field, and this logic is the same logic that we basically performed inside our create page, right? So if empty, $_post, $field, because the field will contain the key that we're trying to access. That variable will. Okay, so if it's empty, then we're going to create a nicely human-readable version of the field name. So we'll do a string replace first. We'll replace all underscores with a space in the field variable. And then we'll do the same thing again, only this time we'll do UC words, $formatted, which will basically uppercase each word. And then last but not least, we'll create a new error message. And we'll use string interpolation, $formatted, cannot be empty, with an exclamation mark. So once again, we're including our config file, right? Because that's what gives us our root path, our base path, and access to all of our helpers. Then we're checking to see if the session has started. If it hasn't, we'll start the session. We create an errors container to hold all of our errors. And notice the naming convention we used is plural because we're assigning an array that will contain multiples of the same value. Next, we create another array called required, which will contain the field names that we require to exist in order for us to create the record or to update the record. We iterate over each of those field names and we check to see if the post field name is empty. If it's empty, we create a nice human readable formatted string. So for example, the first time we iterate, if there is no first name and they forgot it, we'll pass it into string replace. We'll take out the underscore. We'll replace it with a space, right? So now it's first space name. Then UC words will take first space name and make it capital F and capital N on it. So it'll be capital F first space capital N name cannot be empty. Then on the next iteration, it will do the same thing with last name. And then it will do the same thing with email, but because there's no underscores, obviously it doesn't need to replace anything, but it still will uppercase email for us. Any questions about any of that logic? No? Pretty clear? Hopefully, human readable, maybe? All right. So next we're going to verify that the email address is in the correct format. So the correct format for an email address, the symbol name at the beginning, right? So your name or whatever it is. So in my case, Sean.McKinnon. So the symbol name at the beginning, the @ symbol, right? Which basically tells email systems that this is the person at this thing, right? The thing after that is called the domain, right? So that's the address of where you're going to. So in my or your scenario, right, your name at Georgian College, that's the domain name. And then your it's not extension, it's called the upper domain, or the it's not the upper domain. First domain. The first domain, which is the .com, .ca, .on.ca, all of those things. That's how that URL is broken down, right? Basically tells them how to read the URL. So what the filter var will do is it will actually verify that the email format is correct. It will not verify that the email exists. That is super important to understand. So they can still give you a completely false email address. It doesn't matter. You don't really need to care about that. All you need to care about is that it's in the correct format. That's it. So that's what we're going to do. To do that, we're going to do if. We'll just do it inline. If not, right? The not operator, which is the exclamation mark. If not, filter bar, which is a function in PHP that takes two arguments. The first argument is the value it's assessing. So we're going to say post email, which is where our email address is currently stored. And then the second part is what you want to filter, right? So we're filter validating right now. So we're going to do filter validate email. So if our email address is not in the correct format, then we will add errors. We'll use the nice shorthand text for doing a push, and we'll push on a new error message saying your email is not in a valid format. I worked for a company for a short time, very short time. We had kind of different visions, and they didn't like this. They didn't like how developers speak. Your email is not in a valid format. They hated that. They said it wasn't personable. They're like, users read that and it sounds very dry and very technical. I'm like, well, it's a technical thing that's happening, so it makes sense. They're like, no. We want you to make it so that we can change all of these. It's such a pain in the butt. So I created a great big configuration file, and I had to link every single one of these stupid error messages to the configuration file so they could go in. And of course, they wouldn't modify the configuration file. No, had to build them an interface. And they would go into the interface and they would modify every one of those messages. And they would say things like, hey, champ, your email is wrong, and stuff like that. Whatever. What a waste. But yeah. So keep that in mind. Make sure you speak in the voice of the company you're working for. That's super important. Also, when you're writing error messages, cannot stress this enough, and this is not an international versus domestic thing because I see it all the time. Check your spelling, check your grammar, make sure what you're writing makes sense, right? Be very clear because those error messages are seen by users, right? So you got to make sure that what they're reading is correct. All right, so verify the email address. I think this is a good place to basically say if any of the above is an error, then we're getting out of there. We're sending the user back to the form and saying, go fix this because something's wrong, okay? So we're going to write our first basically error check. So you guys have written it before. If, so any errors, if, we'll count the errors array. So count the errors array, and if it's greater than 0, which would mean that we have errors, right? So if the array contains even one error, then our first step, session / danger equals $errors. So we'll just store the array right in there. We'll also pass back the current state of the form for them. Form data equals $_post. And then we'll redirect. Now I have it in my notes that we'll write header and exit, but we don't need to do that anymore, right? If I want to redirect now, how do I redirect? You guys remember? It's been a week. Exactly. We created a function. Made this so much easier on ourselves. We just type in redirect because we have our wonderful helper function that comes from the config file. And then we tell it where we want it to go. We want you to go to base path dot users slash edit dot php question mark ID equals, and we need to make sure we return back to the same location, $ underscore post ID. So the ID they gave us. There we go. What do you mean?
Like it's sending them back, but I mean it's only the admin that can go to the
No, you as a user can edit your own profile. So we'll do double duty. We haven't done that part yet because we have to do some permission checking. Basically, we have to say if you're trying to edit anybody's profile but your own, then we'll boot you back to the home page. But if you're editing your home profile, then that's fine. We'll let you edit your own profile. An administrator should be able to administer any user, essentially. So yeah, I see what you're saying, but the administrator does care about, because this doesn't necessarily fall into the security piece. This falls into the normalization piece. I don't want email addresses accidentally going in that aren't in the correct format for two reasons. One, I want all my emails to look the same because I have OCD. And two, I want to be able to use their email addresses to email them things. If it's not in the correct format, I can't send an email, right? So that kind of does double duty in that scenario. Yeah. And there's also the potential chance of a pissed off employee who then sticks JavaScript using the form into your system and creates cross-site scripting hacks and stuff like that. So you got to worry about those type of things too. I'm a developer. I'll just put a kill switch in somewhere. That's it. Oh, you're not going to pay me? Cool. Done. Click. Down. Go fix that. Yeah. Don't do that. That's a good way to get sued. Don't do that. Yeah, that's true. I mean, yeah, it's like, have you ever seen Reindeer Games? Real crappy movie, but Reindeer Games. It's like with Ben Affleck. So he plays a car thief, right? So this guy, he abducts Ben Affleck and he puts him in a storage container and ties his hands to a steering wheel of a car. The guy's a car thief. And he's like, don't put a car thief behind the wheels of a car. Like, that's obvious, right? Same thing with a developer. Don't piss off a developer when they have access to your application. Bad things can occur, right? That's the way it works. All right, so if we have errors, we're going to kick them back, and this is always a good place to check to see if our current application is working. Notice we haven't brought in our connection script. We're not doing any costly database stuff yet. We're just going to do the simple check. Then we'll do the costly database stuff, right? All right, let's jump back over to the browser here. And we can go back to the page before, right? Hit refresh. Just take some of the fields out. Just leave them empty. Maybe remove the @ symbol. I'm going to type @ like the word at. And then hit submit. Oh, use of undefined constant root, assumed root. This will throw an error. Update line 13. Oh my God. All right. So likely the issue is because I'm trying to access a constant that I defined in this file, which was not very smart on my behalf. So remove this part and just use that part. Sorry about that. 20 years of programming does not make you infallible. Not by any means. All right, so once you remove that little bit on this line here, this is the line that we're editing there, folks. All right, once you get rid of root dot, we should be good. Go back. I'm going to go back and refresh and resubmit. All right, goodbye, Fred 2. See you later, Flintstone. Replace at with the word at. And submit. First name cannot be empty, last name cannot be empty, and your email is not in a valid format. All right. Does anybody need me to post that to Slack? Yeah, okay. I will post that to Slack for you. Let me pull open Slack. I don't even have it open. Are you yelling at your code?
No, I'm yelling at him.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
He's the one there.
Slash users slash update.php is where this file is going. Now, I said this last week, but just in case you forget, copying and pasting code, gentlemen, copying and pasting code from PHP will make it very difficult because it creates these weird new line characters when you copy from Slack. Much better just to download and then take it from your download and put it in. Then it will work, and you won't wind up with weird new line errors. All right, so our validation is still not done. All we've really completed is the validation that I kind of call it soft validation, right? It's like you had some empty forms, you know, your format was kind of incorrect. Just soft validation. We haven't done anything that's costly yet. Even though really the cost of us connecting to the database is not that much, you still have to consider it. So our next step is to actually connect to the database. But before we do that, we're going to sanitize our data. Anytime we're going to give any data to the database whatsoever, we need to sanitize that data first. Super important. So, sanitize our data. So the first thing we're going to sanitize is the email address, and we'll just store it right back in the post. Equals filter var. Give it the argument, which is the value of our email, and then what filter we want to do, and this time it's filter sanitize email. And we're going to do a few more. We're going to filter our ID, and actually that reminds me that we totally forgot to tell it the ID, which we are going to have to do. We do. We know it. All right. What we're going to have to do is in our form, if we have an action, we're going to need to make sure that we add the user ID as a hidden field. And the reason that is because when we get this post, we need to know what user to look up so that we can edit that user. Now, we could use the user's email to do it. That would work. That would be totally fine. But it would be a good idea to actually use the user ID. And what we could even do is actually use a combination of the user ID and email to make it even harder for a hacker to just try IDs and email addresses back and forth. But yeah, so let's do this properly. So we'll go to our form.php. And right under here, because it's not something that you're going to be able to see, it's not a visible thing because it'll be a hidden field, we're going to add an inline if condition that basically says if is set $_ action and is set $ form data. We need both those things to exist. PHP and if. I like to write the whole block because it just makes it nice and easy. So if both of those are there, we're going to create a new input with the type of hidden. So this will be invisible. And we're going to hard code the value to be equal to $form_data ID, which is coming from that user. Okay. Like so. Actually, let's think about that for a second. Maybe that's not a good idea. No, that works. That's totally fine. Yeah, that logic is fine. Because we're returning back the post, we don't want to accidentally make it that we don't have the ID field. We definitely need it. So, but it will work because we'll return back it with the ID. So you're writing these 3 lines all together, guys. All right. So what that's checking for is to see if the action variable is set, which it should be always set, so it doesn't really matter. We're also checking to see if the form data variable is set. Actually, there is a logic issue there. Yeah, we do have a logic issue. Because even on the create page, if there's an error, the form data will be set, but that ID will be missing. So we will have an error. And what will happen is this will blow up because it won't be able to fill in that field. So the easier way to fix this, trying to think what the easier way would be to do that. Why don't we actually check to see if, there, that should fix it. So if it contains the key of ID, then we're good to go. So if form data is set and the key ID is this, then we'll be fine. Oh, sorry, I'll move my mouse. So I just added in the square brackets ID to that piece and fix this one. That's better sound logic. I know I didn't put that in my thing here, but. All right, anybody still typing that out? Cool. So let's go back to update for a second. Now we can go ahead and sanitize that as well. So we're going to sanitize the ID because people can edit those fields just by inspecting and editing them directly. And this one is filter, sanitize, integer or number int. It's a weird one. It's another one of those inconsistency things. Like, for example, when we're doing casting, it's param_int, but for some reason sanitize is number_int. So it's one of those weird inconsistency things that PHP suffers from. We also have 2 strings to validate. We can write a small for each loop. I would argue that actually benchmarked, the for each loop might actually be more costlier than just doing them individually. This is an inline for each loop, meaning that because we only have one statement that we're executing, like any of the block type structures in PHP, actually in most programming languages, we don't need the curly braces because we're literally just executing that value immediately afterwards. So $_post, whoops, $field equals filter var. I'll put this on the next line. Filter var $_post, $field, and filter sanitize string. So that will sanitize all of our values coming back from the form. And now we'll be able to do the logic that we need to do with checking to see if the user actually exists, because we need to do that. Not only do we need to check to see if the user exists, we also need to verify that they're not attempting to use an email that has already been used, right? Because we can't register the same email address, that type of stuff. That one's a tricky one because we need to check it based on the idea that they're not trying to register their own email again, right? Because like I said, we're going to nuke and pave. We don't want to tell them their email address already exists if it is their email address that they've already registered. So we need to be a little cautious about our logic. But we'll take it nice and slow. All right, I'm going to scroll down a little bit. So our first step is get requested user. So we're going to do a SQL statement. Select star from users where ID is equal to, oops, sorry about that. Stop that. There we go. ID is equal to $_post ID. Then we'll prepare that statement. Whoops. Did that wrong. $con. Prepare that SQL. And obviously the only way con's going to exist is if we include it. So let's make sure we include it. There we go. We'll include it and create our connect variable once I'm done having a stroke. And then next, we'll bind the parameter. So we'll bind ID to $_post ID. And we'll make sure it gets casted, even though this is a bit more redundant because we just sanitized it. So it should be guaranteed to be an ID or a number. We'll execute. And then that will result in having a user. Now, the cool thing is, because we've already done this bind param step, we can actually get away with using nice, light, simple SQL queries from this point on that don't require us to do bound parameters until we get to the update step. When we get to the update step, we'll have to use bound parameters. But the next checks that we do to check to see if their email is accurate, we can just use a simple SQL query to do that because we've already validated this user and we'll just use the user's data. Making that noise. They're playing with. First time driver, long time user. Yeah, it's a bit of a wall of code to write, but absolutely necessary, unfortunately. So we've got our user back, so now we've got to do some more validation. Validation with our retrieved user. First validation check, does this user actually exist? Because we can't update a user that doesn't exist, right? So that's the first check. So if not $user, meaning the user does not actually exist, right? Because one thing that's cool about fetch, if it can't find anything, it will return false. So we can say if not user, then $errors, square brackets, equals this user could not be found. They're lost. The next check we're going to do is to check to see whether or not the email address already exists, only if it's not the email address they have currently registered. So the cool thing is we can check this in two ways. One, we can assume that if they're editing a profile, they are logged in, which means we have them currently stored in the session, right? So we can verify against their session email versus the email they're trying to register and see if those two match. If they match, then we won't bother checking for anything. We'll just leave it alone. If they don't match, then we're going to see whether or not that email address is already in the system. Because if the email address is in the system already, then we don't want to try to reapply it, right? So I think it's better to do than to try to figure that out. So we're going to say if $_post email does not equal $user's email, so the user that we brought back, if those two emails do not match, then we're going to have to do a SQL statement of select email from users where email is equal to a bound email address. We'll make our statement equal to the connection variable preparing the SQL. We'll bind our parameter. Provide the value. And make it a string. Then execute it. And then we might as well just check it right in line. If not empty, because if the email address exists, then that's it. We don't want to do anything with it. We want to just basically say that there's an error. So we'll just say if empty stmt fetch, because fetch will return false or not false. $errors, and we'll push on a new value, equals this email is unavailable. And once you hit this point, this is a good point to basically say, okay, if they don't exist in the system, or if they're attempting to register an email that already exists that is not their own, then we're going to go ahead and send their errors back and say, okay, you messed up. You need to fix one of these two things, okay? And then the good news is the last step will be to update our user, but we'll test this to make sure this works. I'll just wait for you to finish writing down the wall of text, and then we'll add our error message. Is anybody not okay if I scroll to about here? Is that okay? Okay. And hear yelling. Check for errors. I mean, you can scroll up to where we did the last check because it's going to be the exact same code. So you don't need to write it again. You can copy and paste. So if we have any errors, we'll create a danger. Danger, Will Robinson. Errors. I was so excited that they're actually going to do a season 2 of that show, which is awesome. We'll add the post in. Yeah, Netflix. Yeah, for Lost in Space. I thought the first season was pretty good. It was pretty solid. Anybody watch The Mandalorian? The Mandalorian? So Disney Plus released yesterday, and one of their things is all these new shows, right? So if you're a geek like me, you like comic books and stuff like that. Star Wars, Mandalorian, so Boba Fett, that's what he is. He's a Mandalorian. They released a whole show based on that species of people and them going and picking up bounties and stuff like that. And episode 1 dropped yesterday, and episode 2 will drop on Friday. And it's good. Like, it's solid. It's a solid show. All right, so we're going to redirect to the base path, users, edit.php, ID equals. And this time we can just go to user. No, we should actually go to post. And that's that. So once that's actually completed, right, what we can do is go and check and see if any of those errors are still, applicable and they work and all that type of stuff. And it's a good idea to do that as you write big walls of scripts. Take each chunk and test it, right? Make sure it's actually working. If we had more time in this course and this course was broken over like, I don't know, say 30, 42 weeks instead of just 14 weeks, we would get into using a test suite and actually learning how to use a test suite to test our code, which would be definitely the best way to do this. However, we're limited, so we kind of have to just rock it raw. All right, anybody still typing that out before I switch pages? No? Okay. I think we'll finish update tonight, and then we'll call it quits. That'll put us in line with the other 2 classes anyways. And then if you have any project support questions that you need help with, I would be happy to help you. So I'll stick around for any of those type of issues. We have about 20 more lines of code, not even 10 more lines of code. Yeah, it's about 10 more lines of code. In the first connection block up here. Oh, yeah, that's not good. Nice catch. Thank you. Yeah, on line 40, that should definitely be a bound param. Yeah. It's been a long day. Nice catch. Yeah, that is definitely a stupid. Don't do that. That is how SQL injections occur, is making mistakes like that. So yeah, line 40, where I wrote the select star from users where ID equals, and I put in the post ID. It shouldn't be. It should be the bound parameter. So just fix that so it's the bound parameter and not the post. So that's our first connection thing that we did. Get the requested user. So go ahead and make sure you change that over. So you're going to remove the $_post user ID, and you're going to replace it with just ID, the colon ID. All right? Cool. The The reason why we don't want to use a non-bound parameter is because taking user data and putting it directly in is how we wind up with things like SQL injection, because now you're taking the user's data and running it right in line with your SQL statement. That's how you wind up with SQL injection. Definitely don't want that to happen. All right. Are we good? Yes, Andre? No worries. Bye, such great. Just a note while we're waiting as well, my user notes don't always necessarily reflect what we do in class. Sometimes as I'm typing, I'll see my own errors and issues, and I will correct them. I mean to go back and update the notes, but it doesn't always work out that way, just to warn you. So definitely if you're doing any studying, definitely listen to the videos because it's worth your while. Or just come to class and have fun. That's also works. Are you still typing code or fixing a problem? Okay, we're good? Out of curiosity, what editor are you using? VS Code? Are you taking advantage of the hints when they pop up? Yeah, no worries. Not a problem. All right, so let's go ahead and see if this stuff actually works. So we'll jump over to our page. We'll refresh. Right now, I don't even have a edit. So I'm going to click on my profile, change this over to edit. So now I have my information. I'm going to clear my information. And I'm going to hit submit. That'll kick back the first name, last name can't be empty. I'm noticing it's also kicking me back to a address that doesn't contain the profile ID in it. So we need to fix that because for some reason we're not getting back to the correct location. We have to keep going through my profile in order to do it. All right, I'm going to enter in the password and I'm going to try to register a user that already exists with an email address that already exists. So I'm not using my own, I'm using another user that's already in the system. So if you don't know of another user in the system, open up the phpMyAdmin, open the users table and go grab one. Going to click submit. User could not be found. So it wasn't able to find it based on our ID. And this email is unavailable, meaning that the email is taken up. Now, the one that says the user could not be found shouldn't have happened. We should have definitely been able to find the user. So I'm guessing that for some reason our hidden field is not happening. Yep, see, the hidden field is missing, which means that our ID is never getting sent to the back end. So we definitely need to fix that. So that would be form.php. The logic in here, something is goofy and it's causing it to not send back. So right now in form data, our condition is set to if is set action and is set form data ID. And I'm pretty sure both of those are actually set. So that is weird that we're not getting that back. Let's just, we can always do a var dump, which is super handy. Sorry, that needs to be in PHP. Var dump. You can do this if you want, or you can just watch me do it. Oops. Yeah, you see I'm getting form data as false. That's not a good sign. The form data should definitely have our form in it. Let's go to edit. Maybe we have an issue of where things are located. Nope, there's the session form data. We made it equal to the fetch of the user. There's the header, which should be pulling it in and changing it over. So the only thing I can think of is that it's possible that we are not getting a user back. I'm going to change this over to user, and I'm going to bar dump that out. Yeah, so we're not even getting a user back based on the ID. Well, I don't have an ID in there right now. That could be part of the problem. There we go. That's the user. And there's our hidden value. So I'm not sure why it wasn't working the first time around. I didn't make any changes. So there's Fred. And there's our input. Oh, it has no name. See how our input doesn't have a name attribute inside of it? That's why it's not getting picked up in the update form. If we jump back, we need a name field in here. Inside your form.php, add another attribute called name and make it equal to ID. That's what was missing. And then our form should work correctly. That's also why it wasn't redirecting correctly, because it didn't have the ID field in the post block. All right, so once you have the name ID in there, we can go back to the actual browser. So here's the browser. I'm going to click on my profile. I'm going to change it to edit. And I'm going to try to use the ASDFs at asdf.com and hit submit. And it says the email is unavailable, and it returned me back to the correct page. There's my page, and it populated the data. Now, one thing you'll notice, though, it's changed my email address back to sean.mckinnon@georgiancollege.ca. It didn't leave it as asdf@asdf.com. And the reason for that is even though in our update page, we're returning back the post data, in our edit page, we're overwriting any session form data with the user we pull back from the database. So what we need to do is we need to perform a little bit of conditional logic. If session form data is already set and contains data, it needs to use that. That should take priority. Otherwise, it should use the user. So it should be one or the other, not both, right? So what we'll do is in front of this, now I added this extra line. I'll fix this code so it doesn't have that extra line. There you go. So now ours all look the same. So all we'll do is we'll literally type out the variable name a second time, and we'll use the double question mark or operator. And what that will basically say is if session form data has information in it, use it. Otherwise, use the user that I fetched. That's a better user experience instead of blowing away the user's changes every time. All right. So if you jump over to your browser, I'm going to try changing this to asdf@asdf.com again, even though I know it doesn't work. I'm going to hit submit. It says the email is unavailable, but asdf@asdf.com stays in place. So it doesn't delete the stuff that I put in already, right? So that's a better user experience, and we have a better form. Okay, we're ready to update the user column, and then we'll call it a night. So under update.php, we're going to attempt to update the user. So we've done all of our error handling. We've done all of our validation and sanitization. Now we're just going to update the user. So step one, let's just create that avatar variable, because if they change their email address, we'll want to use the new email address to generate a new avatar. And the link is http://api@adorable.io avatars/300/$_post email. So that will create our avatar link for us. And then we're going to write our SQL statement. Now, like I was saying before, our logic is a little bit weird here because we have the password field, right? If the password field contains a password, then we will attempt to update the password. If there's no password field, like there's nothing in it and it's empty, then we'll just leave whatever password we already have in the database and move on, okay? So what we should do actually before we write this SQL, we should deal with that password. So we're going to write an if condition that basically says if not empty, $_password, post, password as the key. It's getting late and my brain's getting stupid. If it's not empty and the post password is there, we're going to perform a couple of steps. First is an error check. If the post password does not match the password confirmation, actually we should do that as an actual block. Then we'll set an error message. Your password must match the password confirmation. And we'll redirect them back to the base path, users, edit.php, ID equals all right, so we'll set the flash and we'll redirect them back. We should also actually set the session form data as well. There we go. Otherwise, and I don't need to write this as an else statement, because if this if condition isn't valid, then we're going to redirect and exit anyways. So an else is just redundant. So what I can do actually is just write the logic directly, because if this fails, it will redirect anyway. It does. Your password must match. There we go. We'll reassign password. password hash. So we're going to rehash the password just like we did before. So basically, if there's any issue with the password, if they enter a password and there's any issue with the password, we'll return back an error. If there's nothing wrong with it, then we'll rehash the new password and store it. So that'll take care of that little bit of validation. Next, we'll write our SQL for the user to be updated. So it's $SQL equals update users, doesn't ever, set. And this is one thing that's weird too. Like the insert command for MySQL or for any SQL database is insert users, and then in brackets you put the column names, and then you say values and you set the value names, right? But update users is not done the same way. The format is completely different, and I don't understand why they wouldn't have just made it basically the same way. It would make sense. It would be easier to translate. It's another one of those inconsistency issues. It's kind of annoying. Whereas with Mongo, it is the same. Like creating and updating in Mongo is the same format. Like it takes the entire same format. So it was thought out a little better. But this is weird. Basically, the way you do it is it's the name of the column, then equal to the bound parameter that you want to make it equal to. So first underscore name. And you basically just keep doing that. Last underscore name is equal to colon last underscore name. Little tedious. Email is equal to colon email. And avatar is equal to colon avatar. Our SQL is actually going to get broken into 3 separate pieces. The first piece is going to be our default part of our SQL statement. So every single SQL statement we write, every single time we go to update a user, this will execute no matter what. The next piece of SQL statement we're going to write will only execute if a password exists. So we're going to actually append a little bit of information onto the SQL statement. The third piece of SQL we're going to execute will also execute every time, but it's the conditional logic for the SQL statement. So the next piece is going to look like this. If is set $_ password, or post, password. So if it's set, then we're going to do $SQL. And this is something that you haven't seen before. There's 2 ways we can do this. We can either say equals $SQL dot and concatenate on the rest of the message, or we can use the nice shorthand operator, which is concatenate and equal. So we'll literally take the current value of SQL and concatenate on the next piece. We need to put a space because this is literally as if we took this phrase and just butted this right up against it. We need a space between the word avatar and whatever we're doing next, right? Oh, actually, that's not true. We need a comma and a space. And then we need password equals colon password. So if post password exists, we're going to add another field piece. Otherwise, our last bit which will always execute, is our where condition, space, where ID is equal to colon ID. That's our complete SQL statement. So now you go through the same steps that you normally do. You have to prepare, you have to execute, you have to make sure you bind all your parameters, all that piece. Yeah. Yes, sorry, the last one should be dot equals. Thank you. Yeah. Concatenate and add. Yeah. Incidentally, plus equals that you would see in most languages will do the same thing. I'm pretty sure because it happens in C++, if you do plus equals, it will concatenate as well. So it will take the current value and concatenate a new value on. You could probably do the same thing in Java, plus equals, for concatenation, like that. This building a string is a very common thing in programming. Conditional string building. Our next piece is to actually prepare the statement, right? So we'll create the $stmt, make it equal to $con, prepare, $SQL. Now we have our statement. We'll go ahead and bind the parameters that we know for sure we need, okay? And that's the interesting thing too. Bound parameters doesn't have to happen in the order that they're in the SQL statement. Because we have these placeholders, we can bind them in any order we want. There is a function in PHP called bind value. In that one, the order does matter. You have to make sure you bind them in the correct order. But in the way we're doing it, we don't need to worry about that. So we're going to create our first one, and then we're going to do a whole heck of a lot of copy and paste. So bind param, first underscore name, make sure you add the colon. $_ post, first underscore name. And then PDO, param, string, like so. One, two, three, 4, 5. If you hold Alt and Shift, so make sure your cursor is floating on that line. Hold Alt and Shift and press down 4 times. Double click on first name and then hit Control D to select the next one. You can do this kind of fun stuff. So double click, Control D, email, email, double click, Control D. And then this one's a bit different. This is ID, and instead of param string, it's param int, because it's an integer. The next one's not quite as fun because it's avatar, but we've already set avatar as a variable. So we can kind of fake it, I guess, a little bit. Like I could get rid of the things I don't need, like the square brackets, then do it. I mean, with the amount of effort that I'm doing, it probably would have been just easier to type it out. And then the last bound parameter is based on the condition of whether or not our password actually exists. Because if our password doesn't exist, then we don't need to do this. So we're going to say if is set $_ post password. Then we can go ahead and do the STMT bind param, and this will be $password $_ post password PDO : param string. And I am definitely kind of tired because we've already done this logic up here. We could have just moved this logic to here and did it in the same block instead of doing it in two separated blocks, but whatever. Oh, I guess we couldn't have actually. No, because we had to keep the statements together. And then after all of that, you can execute. So $stmt, execute. That'll execute the statement. We can set a session variable, flash message for success. You have successfully updated this profile. And then we can redirect. And the best place to redirect is back to the profile you were editing. Oh, sorry, not edit. We would want show. Back to the show profile. One other piece we should add as well. Once the update has occurred, when you're editing your own profile, because we're storing the profile in the session, once this update has happened, the session's user will not be changed. Like it won't reflect the change, right? And that's because the user that's stored in the session isn't connected to the database. It's literally like we took a snapshot of the user at that time and then stored it into the session. They're not connected in any real way, right? So if the database modifies, the session, the user sitting in the session does not modify. They stay the way they are. So what we should do is after a profile change has happened, we should refetch the user and then store the user in the session now with the new updated profile, right? That way, when the user moves to their profile page, it will have their new information, their name, all of the information in their profile, and that's the user that will be connected around. And we won't wind up with any flaws or issues as well. The good news is because we already have the user, because we have their ID, we don't need to write bind params at all because we're the ones providing data that we know is valid and secure already as our condition. I'm going to scroll up a little bit. Fetch updated user. And the great news is this is 3 lines altogether. That's basically it. 4 lines, actually. 4 lines. The first line is $user is going to equal $con, and this is a new function called query. You write your SQL statement directly in here. So select star from users where ID is equal to, and we can actually put the ID directly in here. I wish it wouldn't automatically tab that over. $user that we fetched earlier, ID, because that is not user provided data. That is us provided data. We still need to fetch the user. So user equals, actually we can do this in 1 line, which is kind of nice. We'll just chain on fetch. So that will query and fetch and return and store it into our user. This is actually known as chaining when you do 2 commands on top of each other. We need to unset $user password, right? Because we said before, we want to keep it kind of secure. If anybody hijacks the session, we don't even want them to have the hash password. And now it's just a matter of taking the session, grabbing the user, and making it equal to the user we just got. So 3 lines. 4 if you don't chain fetch. I mean, I thought we'd be able to end a little earlier, but I lied. 9:41. I'll copy this big wall of code. And I'll paste it into here for you. So that's going to go into users update.php. Again, downloading it is much easier than copying it from there and pasting it. And that's basically it. Let's just make sure it works. I'm pretty sure it does, but we'll make sure. There might be logic issues or something, and then I'll help anybody who has any errors, or if you need to talk about your project, and then we'll call it a night. All right. Anybody still typing just before I switch? Okay, a few of you. I guess you guys are all getting like interviews and stuff right now, getting ready for your co-op, or not, if you got some. It's a tough one because you're not only fighting the fact that, like, are you applying through Barrie or anywhere? Anywhere, so like Toronto and everywhere? Okay. So the issue that tends to hold back co-op is that they only get you for 4 months, right? So they're like, do I want to invest and pay for 4 months and then lose this person who I just paid training in, right? Or do I want to just hire somebody who can work endlessly? And what tends to happen is a lot of people will get co-ops, and then the hirer, like the person that hired you, will push for you to drop out and stay on. That happens quite a bit. Or they'll ask you to basically be like, okay, well, we want you to work part-time while you're still in school, which is not so bad. If you're flexible to do that, then I would definitely do that, especially if you're doing some kind of mixed job like Harvey's or Wendy's or something like that. At least this is in your field, probably pays better, right? So if you want to do that for part-time, it's definitely worth your while. But if you are like me, for example, I struggled with working and doing school at the same time. That was not easy for me to do. So I just took a ridiculous bank loan and that I'm still paying off that allowed me to just basically just go to school and do that. So I wasn't able to offer co-ops anything past the 4 months. So I didn't get a co-op, actually. I wound up doing an e-co-op, which is where I just did my own business. And that was it. That was fine. So you also have that as an option. If you can't find a co-op, you can apply to do an e-co-op, where it's just where you just run your own business for 4 months. That's also an option. Yeah. And unfortunately, doing unpaid co-ops are a little easier to get than paid co-ops. But you have to kind of look at it, even though it's unpaid. And I feel kind of crappy for saying this because I feel like nobody should be unpaid, but you are getting paid. You're getting paid in training, right? So you wind up learning this skill. And I will say this right off the bat, what you learn in school and what you learn in your co-op, not even the same realm of each other, right? You will learn so much more in the 4 months of co-op than you will learn in the 2 to 3 years you do at school. Like, definitely, so much more. So just keep that in mind when you're going out for your co-op. That's the thing too, especially if you have dependents and other people to pay for, as well as yourself and your bills and everything else, then obviously, yeah, you need to earn an income. Yeah. You could look for an e-co-op. Yeah. I only recommend e-co-ops if you're a person who can learn on your own very well. If you're the type of person who can stay pretty, stringent and actually go and learn the things you need to learn, then that's definitely worth your while to do an e-co-op. But if you need that kind of guided influence from somebody, then you need to do a co-op for a company. It's just the way it kind of is. All right, let's test this thing and call it a night. We'll refresh. So I'm not going to call him Fred 2. I'm going to call him Wilbur. McAmoy, because it's a funny sounding name. I used to call every single user I created was Bobby B. I did it every single time. Did you ever see that SNL sketch with not Anna Gaspar? What's her name? I can't remember her name, but she used to play Whitney Houston. She'd be like, Bobby B, baby. She used to do like the shoulder shake and everything. So I used to say every character was Bobby B. Yeah, why not? Let's throw it back. Old school, Bobby B. Bobby B. That's funny. ASDF, because actually I don't have to provide a password. Let's make sure that actually works. I should be able to change this user without providing a password. So I'll click submit. Successfully updated. The name changed to Wilbur McAmoy. Email. No, his password will not be blank. That's the other good thing. Let's test that. So if I log out, it was ASDF before. And I log in. My email address has changed though. So if it's blank and blank had went through, I should be able to submit. There was an error. Otherwise, it should just be ASDF, which is what it was originally. That's not a good sign. Maybe the password did change. That's a good question. I don't know. It would be a hard one to even figure out because what is the hash of a space or a blank, I guess? If you're writing a single line, you don't need the curly braces. You don't need to finish that first line off with anything as long as the second line terminates in a semicolon. Yeah, it's almost as if you wrote it on one line. Yeah. Let's see here. So Bobby B, no avatar, no password. Like just no password, like nothing at all. So we blew away the password altogether, and I think I know why. Is set is not what I want. Is set says, is this variable set? Yes, it is. It just happens to be empty. What we want is if not empty is what we want. And we need to do that everywhere we did is set post password. So I think it's only in the two spots. So we'll just change those two. So line 92 and line 80. I think that was the issue. Because it was technically set. Is set actually looks at the memory allocation. So it's actually underneath the hood. It's looking at the memory allocation to see if it's there. And if the memory allocation has been set aside for it, then it's technically set. So it comes back and says that. Not empty does double duty. It will actually check to see if the memory allocation exists. If the memory allocation does not exist, it will return back false. It won't blow up. If the memory allocation exists, but there's nothing inside of it, it will also return back false. So we'll do for both. So we should use not empty wherever we really think about it. Let's just make sure there's no other logic errors like that. Nope, the other one I did properly. This one I did wrong. Not sure why. All right, now unfortunately, because this user is blank, this user is now garbage. I can't even fix it because I can't log in to fix it. So, because I can't give it a blank password because we automatically verify against a hash. So it won't actually work. No, unless the admin can generate a hash password. Oh, no, the admin can. The admin can go back to the user's profile and then modify the password. So yeah, we could have fixed it, but I would have had to log in as another administrator in order to do it. And that was my admin thing. I'll just register a new user. There we go. Register a new user. I'll go make them an administrator. Wherever they got put. Oh, there they are. It's weird that it's not in the same order. There we go. I have my administrator. I'm logged in. I'm going to go to the edit for this. I'll change this to Bobby B. I'll leave the password as blank. I'll hit submit. It modified my email address. I'll log out. I'll log in. Bobby B, ASDF. Everything's working now. So that was the issue. That's interesting, though, the broken avatar picture, but I think we'll leave that for next week. Figure out what's wrong there. Everything's working. All right, so I'll help anybody with a broken app. I'll repost that code because it is definitely not right. It's wrong. I'll just edit the current one that's sitting there. I'm going to go right there. And there we go. Let me just stop this.